Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chav Zayin, volume 27, the second Sicha of Parshas Tzav. This Sicha will explain, according to Rashi, how at times certain prohibitions which may seem to be from the Chachamim, meaning that their source may seem to be from a rabbinical source, yet, in essence, they're really derived from the pussokim themselves, from the Torah itself. It's worthwhile to review the pussokim, the verses which will be discussed in this Sicha. First, of course, the pasuk and the Rashi from our parsha, and as well as the one from Parshas Bishalach, which will help and serve as part of an explanation for the Sicha. So let's look in pasuk Tezvav, that's verse 15, chapter 7 of this week's parsha. It says, "Ubsar zevach," and the flesh, the meat from the offering, biyoim korbana yachel, in the day of the offering it should be eaten. Lo yaniach mimeno haboker, you shouldn't leave anything over until the morning. So Rashi in the heading, the Dibur HaMaschil lo yaniach mimeno ad boker, he says, he explains that what does it mean that you shouldn't leave anything until the morning. So Rashi says, you can eat it the entire night, however. If so, says Rashi, why did they say? Rashi doesn't even specify who they are. Why did they say until Chatzos? That you can only eat it until midnight? Kidei laharchik adam min havera. This is in order to prevent a person from coming to sin, meaning it's a precautionary measure. That if a person is going to have all night to eat, they may be neglectful and they may end up not eating it, and then will come the morning and it will become noiser. Noiser means leftovers, which is a prohibition. Now let's go to Chumash Shmos, book of Exodus, Parshas Bishalach, chapter 16, verse 29. Over there it's discussing the man and the going out on Shabbos or not going out on Shabbos to collect the man. And over there it says, Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Ru'u ki Hashem nasa lachem es haShabbos." See, Hashem gave you the Shabbos. Nobody should go out. And then he says, "Shavu ish tachtav." Each person should stay put, sit in his place. Al yetze ish v'mkoymei b'yom hashvi. Nobody should go out of their place on the seventh day on Shabbos. So there's two Rashis here. The Rashi Shavu ish tachtav. Every person should sit in their place. Says Rashi, Mikan, from here, Samchu Chachamim. The Chachamim kind of relied on, meaning they use this as a source, as a primary source for the 4 amos, the 4 amos liyotzei chutz l'tchum, somebody who goes out of the tchum. If somebody went out of the allowed distance that one may walk on Shabbos, now they have to stay. They can't go back. They can't go forward. However, from here the Chachamim learned that you have 4 amos. What are the 4 amos for? 3 for your actual body, and 1 for being able to move your thing. In other words, you don't have to stand frozen. That's one Rashi. The next Rashi where it says, Al yetze ish v'mkoymei, no man should leave his place, no man should go out of their space. Says Rashi, these are the 2,000 amma of Tchum Shabbos. Now says Rashi, this is not v'loi b'mfurish, this doesn't say it explicitly in the pasuk. Why? Because the whole idea of Tchum Shabbos, or this allotted measurement for Tchum Shabbos, is only midivrei soifrim, from the words of the soifrim, which is another moniker for the Chachamim, for the sages, and v'ikari shel mikra al Likutei haman. However, the pasuk primarily is not speaking about in general about the Tchum Shabbos, but rather this pasuk, this verse, is directed specifically, exclusively to those who were collecting the manna, that they can only go out 2,000 amma. Okay. Another thing to be familiar with as an introduction, in every single korban, every single offering in the Beis HaMikdash, those that were consumed by humans, those who were consumed by either the kohanim or the people that offered the korban, or both, there was always a specific allotted time for when this korban can be eaten. Typically, it's on the day of the korban, the day of the offering. The korbanos will only offer during the day time, and then the night that follows. Or in some cases, the day of the korban, the night that follows, and another day and the night that follows. But in any case, it typically involves the day and the following night. Then there is also the issue of noiser, leftovers. Whenever one offers a carbon, it has to be eaten or consumed or burnt on the altar by a certain time. If it's not done so, comes the next morning, and now it's considered to be noiser. Now you've transgressed. There's a prohibition of even having anything to do with that flesh other than destroying it, other than burning it, because it's now forbidden meat. Another thing to be familiar with, something that we mentioned in the Sicha, the description that we find sometimes for the sages. Sometimes, as we see in Rashi, they're called chachamim, the wise men, the sages. And like in this case we brought before, the Rashi says something, refers to them, or we refer to them as divrei sofrim, the words of the sofrim. Now, what does sofrim mean? Literally, the word sofrim, some say, means scribes. But what it really comes from the word is sofer, count. They had a special, unique quality that they excelled, and they were very elaborate in every single word and every single nuance and every single detail of the Sefer HaTorah. That means they had a special, unique quality of being able to comb through and decipher every single word, every single letter in the Torah to tell us what it means. Then you have Chachamim. Chachamim, as we'll see in the Sicha that Rabbi explains, means scholars, wise men. These were the Chachamim of every single generation, that they were the thinkers. They were the ones who were able to explore intellectually and figure things out and the consequences of various matters, and based on that, to draw conclusions and make precautions. One more final thing, it was something we're well familiar with, in the Klolei Rashi, in the rules of Rashi, which Rashi himself sets, Rashi himself says that he is Ani lo basi elo lefarish pshuta shemikra, that exclusively Rashi's purpose is to explain the basic, simple pshat in the Torah. No more, no less. No history, no halacha, or anything else that he leaves for others. Let's jump into the Sicha. So, in the pasuk, as we said, in our parsha where it says, Upsar zevach Torah shlama, so Rashi quotes the words, Lo yaniach v'menu ad boiker. The Torah says, quote, you shouldn't leave anything over until the morning. Says Rashi, Avol, however, you can eat the entire night, right? If so, says Rashi, why did they say until Chatzos? This is in order to distance a person from coming to do an Avera. Now, on the surface, it seems, who is this Lama Amru? Who was it they who said? Most probably the sages. But however, the question would be then, if this is something which is a rabbinical thing, why is Rashi quoting it? Why is Rashi telling it to us? It's a halachic fact. True. There's nothing untrue about it. But that's not Rashi's purpose. That's not Rashi's objective. Rashi himself says that his whole objective is Pshuta Shemikra. Moreover, why does Rashi say it in the way of Lama Amru? Why did they say such and such? As if implying that it's an already established fact. Where would we know this from? In other words, where was there ever a hint or an indicator in any of the pussokim that we've learned thus far, in any of the verses, that this indeed is the case? And Rashi has to just explain why it's so, or who is the one who established it as such. Why? How is this an assumed fact that we know this? Now the question becomes even stronger when you think about it. This halacha, this din, that you don't leave over until the morning, or I'm sorry, that you can eat it technically until the morning. However, there is an imposed restriction, a precautionary measure, that you can only eat it until midnight, that a person shouldn't come to sin. This doesn't apply exclusively to this type of carbon. Rather, it applies to all the carbonos. So why is it that Rashi is mentioning it here? If it's important to mention, which we'll need to explain, why is it necessary according to Pshuta Shamikra? But if it is necessary, why did Rashi wait until this carbon? We're already way into the second parsha of Chumash Vayikra. We've discussed many karbanos since the beginning of this Chumash. Moreover, the first ever mentioned carbon in the Torah is carbon Pesach, which is in Parshas Bay. And over there, Rashi doesn't say anything either. And over there, it's most appropriate to mention it because first of all, it's the first carbon, and everybody got to consume from it. Second of all, as we're learning the Torah, whether it's in the time of Beis Hamikdash, whether or not, as the case in our times, we also have a connection to this halacha. Because we too, as we sit at the night of the Seder, we make sure to commemorate this halacha by trying to eat the afikoimon before chatzos. So why didn't Rashi mention it there? And therefore this all compels us to say, and leads us to the conclusion, that this idea of eating the korban only until chatzos as a precautionary measure is not midrabanan, but rather it's something that could be learned almost directly from the pasuk itself, and most specifically from the pasuk that Rashi is addressing here, and that's why Rashi was compelled to address it here, and address it in Pshuta Shemikra. How are we going to appreciate this? How to understand this? So the Rebbe takes us back to Chumash Shmos, Parshas Bashalach, and we already discussed it in the introduction, where over there the Torah tells us about the laws of Tchum Shabbos. And over there it says, Shivu ish tachtov. And what does Rashi say? Mikan samchu chachamim. The chachamim relied on. In other words, they use this as a source. Not that it says it explicitly, as Rashi says it himself. V'loi b'mfurash, it doesn't say it explicitly, and Rashi says, she'ein tchumim elam b'divrei seifrim, because the whole concept of tchumim, of Tchum Shabbos being 2,000 amma, is only b'divrei seifrim. And Rashi continues, and he concludes with the words, V'ikare shel mikra aloik tehaman. That really the main essence of the pasuk speaks to not all Jews in all generations, but rather to that generation specifically, the ones who would collect the manna. What does this mean? That according to Rashi, yes, indeed, it's not written explicitly in the pasuk. However, we learn it from the wording of the pasuk, because it doesn't say in the pasuk, follow carefully, it doesn't say in the pasuk, al yetzu lilkoit, that they shouldn't go out to collect. It doesn't say that. It says al yetze ishmim koimai. It doesn't say the gatherers of the man shouldn't go out. It says no man shall go out. In other words, although it's obvious that the pasuk and the context is speaking about and referring to that generation, it was a directive for the people in that generation who were going to go out or should have been going out to collect the manna. But yet the fact that the Torah doesn't write al yetzu lilkoi, they shouldn't go out together. Rather, the Torah writes al yetze ishmel koimei, that no man should go out of place. Therefore, from that we can derive that it's also hinting, that it's also directing us to get an appreciation of what Tchum Shabbos is in general. But since it's mainly and exclusively speaking about the people who of that generation who would gather the manna, therefore Rashi makes a point to tell us that this is all midivrei seifrim. It's not explicitly in the pasuk. It's rather that the seifrim who derived it, who were able to extract it from the pasuk. But Rashi, the reason why Rashi tells us this is to emphasize that this is not something that was enacted in a later generation, but rather right from the beginning, this concept of 2,000 amma was established by the Midivrei Seifrim based on the pasuk. Now, we need to be clear. When you say Seifrim, or even Chachamim, what Rashi says over here, this is not a body of sages or a body of scholars in a certain generation, in a specific generation, but rather it's a title for all the Seifrim, all the scholars of every single generation, even in the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu himself. As soon as he delivered the pasuk and they started to analyze the pasuk, and they started to learn the pasuk, and came with these points that they were able to derive from the pasuk. In other words, it's not a body of chachamim that lived in a specific time. Rather, it's a general euphemism for all the sages in all the generations. Likewise, when it says, let's say in the other Rashi, where it says Shvu ish tachtov, that every man should sit in his place, stay in his place, and Rashi said this is about the 4 amas. This teaches about that each person has his 4 amas, even outside of the Tchum Shabbos. So Rashi uses the term shesamchu chachamim, that the chachamim relied on this. Again, this is not chachamim in a later generation, this is chachamim in that very generation of Moshe Rabbeinu. Understanding this can help us now, we'll apply it to our pasuk. Let's go back to our pasuk. When you look at our pasuk, when you look at the order, you see right away that something seems out of place. What does it say? It says, B'yoim korbana ye'achel. In the day of its carbon it shall be eaten, which, I'm putting this now in parentheses, parenthetically. What is the day of a carbon usually? The day it's offered and the following night. Right? That's what it usually means. However, what does the pasuk continue? It says, Lo yaniach mimenu ad boker. You shouldn't leave over until the morning. Now, if the whole objective of the pasuk was to tell us to when you can eat it, it should have said, B'yom karbana ye'achel ad boker. It should have said, in the day of the carbon it shall be eaten until the morning. And then say, Lo yaniach mimenu, don't leave anything over. But instead, what does it say? It should be eaten in the day of its offering. And then the Torah interrupts this with saying, you shouldn't leave anything over until the morning. So when it comes to this, Rashi says, perhaps we can see that the Torah itself is, so to speak, splitting the two. It's telling us something about eating it in the day of its carbon, and then it's telling us something about not leaving over until the morning. That there's like almost like two separate times. It's almost like two separate times where the Torah is trying to hint to us that they're not eating, they're eating from it on its day is one category. They're not leaving over until the morning is another time. This all seems to hint that there is a specific time for eating that is prior to the lo yiniach mimenu ad boker, that to the time that you shouldn't, quote unquote, leave over until the morning. But the question is, if this is the case, why is Rashi saying that this is for the Chachamim? Maybe you can say it's explicitly. So the answer is because the Torah doesn't say explicitly that you're not allowed to eat it only until midnight. The Torah seems to be saying two things and bundling up together, that you can eat it and not leave over until the morning. It's not so clear. It's only because of this nuance, because the Torah interrupted it, as we explained before, that Rashi says from here the Chachamim, using their logic, using their wisdom, were able to extract it, were able to understand this. And therefore, min haTorah, the eating time is till the morning. However, min the Chachamim, it's until Chatzos, because the Torah hinted that we need to make a precautionary measure. Now we can appreciate why Rashi doesn't bring this in Parshas Bo. Because in Parshas Bo, when you look there in the discussion regarding the Korban Pesach, the pasuk doesn't say eating and not leaving over together. The pasuk says, "V'lo soisiru mimenu ad boker." You shouldn't leave anything over until the morning. It doesn't say anything about eating it. So there's no implication there. There's nothing that implies that the Torah is telling us eating is one time period and leaving over is another time period. And therefore there, in Pshuta Shemikra, Rashi had no business saying anything, and that's why he didn't say anything. Although halachically it's the same as here. But remember, Rashi doesn't teach us halacha. Rashi teaches Pshuta Shemikra. Over here, Rashi was compelled to say it because the pasuk itself hints that there's something here. Now we see the amazing precision in the words of Rashi and the way he uses the varying expressions. When it comes to the Isur Tchumim, when it comes to the 2,000 Amma of Tchum Shabbos, what did Rashi say? Midivrei Soifrim. Remember, he says from the words of the Soifrim. When it comes to the 4 Ammas, to how much each person's quote-unquote personal space is, there he uses the term Mikan Samchu Chachamim. Likewise by us, when it comes to making this precautionary measure of not going all the way until the morning, but rather till Chatzos, again Rashi uses the term Amru Chachamim. Why the difference? As the Rebbe as follows. Soifrim stresses, it indicates the vast knowledge in this Soifrim, Sefer Torah, in the Torah. Chachamim, this represents, as we said in the introduction, the logical and intellectual abilities. What does that mean? You see, when you talk about precautionary measures, halachic precautionary measures, typically that is in the realm of chachamim. Why? What is a chacham? The chacham understands things. The chacham appreciates the character of people, the nature of the human being, and therefore they can figure out what kind of problems could come about, what kind of problems can come about as a result of the typical nature, the typical character, disposition of a human being. And therefore they're able to set precautionary measures. Soifrim, on the other hand, their exclusive talent, if I may, is that they're able to figure out from the psukim, they're able to be medayik in the psukim and see things that are as if they're written there. And therefore, when it comes to the 2,000 amma, there's no logic why it's 2,000 amma, why it's not 3,000 amma, why it's one. This is not a precautionary measure. This is not something which is contingent or a result of human nature. Rather, this is the way the Torah wants it. This is something that Soifrim figured out from the psukim. However, when it comes, let's say, to the 4 ammas that we established when the Torah says you shouldn't leave your space, what is this? What is your space? And the Chachamim are the ones who understood that this must result in 4 ammas. This must translate, into 4 ammas. Why? Because you need 3 ammas for the person's body themselves, and then you need some space to move around. A person, they understood that a normal person, if they're stuck somewhere especially, they cannot be confined to one spot, to one position where they'll be frozen for whole Shabbos. A normal human being needs to move their hand, needs to move their feet, needs to move around a little bit. And therefore, using, so to speak, a chachamindika logic, an intellectual logic, they were able to come to the conclusion that this is most probably what the Torah means, and that's where they established the 4 ammas. And likewise in our parsha, Rashi uses the expression chachamim, omru chachamim, because once again, although we're learning it out from the pasuk, then to some degree it's hinted in the pasuk, but still at the end of the day, this is a precautionary measure. Precautionary measure means that we understand what the potential problem can be, and based on that, we draw a conclusion, and we make a precautionary line. That's exactly the idea of establishing chatzos a half night earlier than the morning when it comes a time when you're ready for sure not allowed to eat.